Imagine a deafening polar night in February 1943. The Hardangervidda plateau in Norway is one of the harshest and most desolate places on the map of Europe. The temperature has dropped below -20 degrees. An icy wind with snow literally knocks you off your feet and blinds your eyes. At the very edge of a 200-meter cliff overhanging a narrow gorge stand 9 people on skis. They are wearing British military uniforms, beneath which hide Norwegian patriots. In their hands are Sten submachine guns, and on their backs are rucksacks with Nobel 808 plastic explosives. Directly below them, on the opposite impregnable rocky ledge, looms the formidable silhouette of the Vemork hydroelectric power station and chemical plant. This is the most heavily guarded facility of Nazi Germany in Northern Europe. The building is entangled with barbed wire, the approaches are mined, searchlights sweep the area, and an enhanced Wehrmacht guard is on duty on the only suspension bridge. According to all Allied intelligence data, it is within these walls that the most terrible weapon in human history is being created at this very moment: the Nazi atomic bomb. If these 9 men cannot get inside and destroy the heavy water supplies, the Third Reich will obtain an absolute weapon capable of wiping London, Moscow, and New York off the face of the earth. This is precisely how this story entered textbooks, memoirs, and Hollywood blockbusters. But if we discard the glossy, heroic veneer and turn to declassified archives, German protocols, and transcripts of interrogations of scientists, a completely different, much more complex, tragic, and paradoxical picture opens before us. Today we will conduct a deep historical investigation and answer the question: did a handful of saboteurs truly save the world from Hitler's nuclear apocalypse? Or did the Allies carry out a brilliant but completely meaningless operation against a phantom that never actually existed? Let's go back to December 1938, when in a Berlin physics laboratory, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann made a discovery that forever changed the course of human history. They discovered the phenomenon of uranium nucleus fission when bombarded with neutrons. Soon, Lisa Meitner and Otto Frisch provided a theoretical explanation for this process and calculated that during nuclear fission, a colossal amount of energy is released, and new, free neutrons are emitted. The global scientific community instantly realized if conditions are created where the emitted neutrons cause the fission of neighboring nuclei, a chain reaction will occur. And a chain reaction is either an unprecedented source of energy in the form of an atomic reactor or an explosion of catastrophic destructive force. However, a fundamental physical problem arose here. The neutrons emitted during the fission of uranium-235 are fast. To make them more efficiently captured by other uranium nuclei and sustain the chain reaction, they need to be slowed down. Physicists needed a so-called neutron moderator, a substance whose atoms are light but do not themselves absorb neutrons. In nature, there were 2 main contenders for this role: ultra-pure graphite and heavy water, that is, deuterium oxide, where ordinary hydrogen is replaced by its heavy isotope. And here occurs the first fatal turn in the history of the German nuclear project. In 1940, the outstanding German physicist Walter Botha conducted a series of experiments in Heidelberg to measure neutron absorption by graphite. Due to minor impurities of boron and nitrogen in the graphite samples studied, Botha obtained erroneous results and concluded graphite is categorically unsuitable as a moderator. This error is recorded in documents, and the leader of the German Uranium Club, Werner Heisenberg, unconditionally accepts this conclusion. While the Americans, under the leadership of Enrico Fermi, took the path of using graphite, which ultimately led to the creation of the world's first operational reactor in Chicago, Nazi Germany completely cut itself off from this path and placed all its bets on heavy water. However, producing heavy water on an industrial scale in the early 1940s was a task of colossal complexity. The only place on the planet with an existing production facility for heavy water in significant volumes was the Norsk hydro plant in the Norwegian village of Vemork, near the town of Rjukan. The plant was built directly into the rock face by a powerful waterfall, and heavy water was obtained there as a byproduct of the multi-stage electrolysis of water used for producing nitrogen fertilizers. To obtain just 1 liter of heavy water, it was necessary to process tens of tons of ordinary water and expend a gigantic amount of electricity. Before the war, the plant produced no more than 10 to 15 kilograms of heavy water per month, and even that was primarily for the laboratory needs of physicists worldwide. When the Wehrmacht occupied Norway in April 1940, the German command and representatives of the Uranium Club literally appeared on the doorstep of the Vemork plant the very next day. German engineers demanded that the management of Norsk Hydro immediately increase production of heavy water, first to 100 kilograms per month and then to a ton or more. For Berlin, this facility became the strategic lifeblood of the entire Reich's nuclear program. Any information about Vemork was immediately classified, and the security of the facility was placed under the direct control of the occupation troops and the Abwehr. In London, British intelligence MI6 and the specially created Special Operations Executive, SOE, were closely monitoring the situation in Norway. Norwegian professor of physical chemistry Leif Tronstad played a key role in gathering information. He was the one who had designed the electrolysis installation at Vemork before the war. After fleeing to Great Britain, Tronstad provided the Allies with the most detailed blueprints of the plant, pipeline schematics, the layout plan of the high-concentration workshops, and even specified the thickness of the floor slabs. Alarming reports came from Norway via underground radio transmitters. The Germans were shipping out containers of heavy water by the trainload. Production was expanding, and German specialists were arriving at the plant. A genuine panic began in Winston Churchill's War Cabinet. The Allied Joint Intelligence Committee reported that if Germany obtained a sufficient amount of heavy water, Heisenberg would start a nuclear reactor by the end of 1943, and by 1944, Hitler would have a plutonium bomb. The British leadership made an unequivocal decision. The production of heavy water at Vemork must be stopped at any cost, regardless of any potential casualties or destruction. The first stage of the operation was given the codename Grouse. In October 1942, 4 Norwegian agents of the Special Operations Executive under the command of Jens Anton Poulsen, parachuted onto the harsh, high mountain plateau of Hardangervidda. The group also included Arne Kjelstrup, Knut Haugland, and Klaus Hellberg. Their mission was to conduct reconnaissance on the ground, set up an observation post, check the plant's security system, and prepare a landing site for the main force of the sabotage group. However, from the very beginning, nothing went according to plan. The advance group was dropped significantly off course from the designated point. Finding themselves in an icy wilderness far from their dropped equipment containers, the Norwegians were forced to fight for survival for several weeks. The temperature dropped, fierce blizzards began, and their provisions quickly ran out. In their memoirs, the group members described how they had to subsist on lichen, reindeer moss, and the entrails of shot wild reindeer. But despite the hellish conditions and frostbite, Poulsen's group survived, established contact with London, and confirmed the target was ready for attack. In November 1942, the British Command of Combined Operations launched the second phase, Operation Freshman, Novichok. It was a daring and incredibly risky idea to send 34 British sapper volunteers from the Royal Engineers in 2 heavy airspeed Horsa gliders, which were towed by Halifax bombers across the North Sea. The gliders were to land directly on the frozen Lake Mosvatten near the plant, link up with the Norwegian intelligence group Grouse, immediately storm Vemork, blow up the electrolysis workshop, and withdraw to the Swedish border. This operation turned into a complete and bloody disaster for the Allies. On the night of November 19th, a fierce storm raged over the coast of Norway. There was zero cloud cover, and icing instantly bound the wings of the aircraft. The tow ropes could not withstand the strain and snapped. One bomber and both gliders crashed in the snowy Norwegian mountains. Some of the British soldiers died upon impact with the cliffs. Those who survived the crash were captured by the Wehrmacht and the Gestapo. And here, the full mercilessness of total war was revealed. A month before these events, in October 1942, Adolf Hitler issued a secret order number 003830/42, which went down in history as the Commando Order, Commando Befehl. According to this document, any captured personnel of Allied sabotage units taken prisoner in Europe, even if they were in full military uniform and had surrendered voluntarily, were to be immediately shot on the spot or handed over to the Gestapo security service for interrogation, followed by liquidation. The German command in Norway carried out the Führer's order with unrelenting cruelty. All the wounded and surviving British sappers from Operation Freshman were subjected to harsh interrogations. 14 men were shot the very next day, and the rest were taken to the Greeny concentration camp and later tortured and killed in the Gestapo basements in Oslo. Not one of the 34 operation participants returned home. Let's ponder these numbers. 34 young men died without even seeing their target, and their deaths only warned the enemy. For the Allies, this was a terrible blow. But worse still, Operation Freshman completely revealed their hand. German counterintelligence instantly understood that Vemork was the primary target of the British Special Services. The commander of the occupation forces in Norway, General Nicolaus von Falkenhorst, immediately arrived at the plant. On his orders, the guard at Vemork was increased several times over. Additional minefields were laid around the plant, anti-aircraft batteries were deployed, and powerful searchlights and machine gun nests were installed. The sole suspension bridge across the deep ravine connecting the plant to the outside world was turned into an impregnable fortress, with inspections conducted around the clock. In London it became clear. A large-scale frontal operation involving army units or gliders was doomed to failure. Another attempt to land British troops would only lead to more senseless casualties. The British leadership turned to the Norwegian section of the Special Operations Executive. It was decided to form a new, ultra-mobile group from among Norwegian volunteers who had undergone special training in Scotland. The operation was given a new code name, Gunner's Side. 23-year-old Lieutenant Joachim Ronneberg was appointed the group's commander. He was a cool-headed, silent, and incredibly collected man who possessed unquestionable authority among the fighters. Along with him, the group included Knut Haukelid, Kasper Idland, Frederick Kaiser, Hans Storhaug, and Birger Stromsheim. They were all natives of Norway, excellent skiers, knew the local climate, and were prepared to die rather than be taken prisoner. The planning of Operation Gunnerside was distinguished by its jeweler-like precision. Runeberg and Tronstad spent hours analyzing the model of the Vemork plant. The analysis of approaches to the facility indicated 3 theoretical routes. The first was across the suspension bridge over the 200-meter gorge. But the bridge was guarded by a solid cordon of Germans, was mined, and could be raked with fire from several points. A firefight breaking out there would instantly alert the entire garrison. The second route was to descend from the steep mountain ridge above the plant. But this slope had been completely mined by German sappers and was entangled with wire netting. There remained a third route, which the German command considered absolutely impossible for a human. To descend to the very bottom of the 200-meter gorge, cross the half-frozen, raging river Maana, and then scale the almost vertical cliff face on the opposite side, emerging right at the plant's territory near the railway line used to deliver raw materials to the facility. It was on this seemingly suicidal option that Runeberg placed his bet. The Germans considered the gorge an impassable natural barrier and therefore barely patrolled the railway gate. In mid-February 1943, the Gunnerside Group was successfully parachuted onto the Hardangervidda plateau. After meeting up with the exhausted but unbroken fighters of the Grouse Group, the Norwegians formed a united sabotage team of 9 men. Several days were spent on reconnaissance and waiting for perfect weather conditions. The night of February 27th to 28th, 1943, would later be featured in all textbooks on Special Forces tactics. A severe blizzard was raging on the plateau, visibility was no more than a few meters, and the temperature had dropped to -25 degrees Celsius. For the saboteurs, this was ideal camouflage. Dressed in white camouflage smocks over their British uniforms, the 9 commandos began their descent into the icy gorge. Descending the icy cliffs in total darkness with heavy packs on their backs required incredible physical endurance. Every misstep could lead to a fall into the abyss. Having overcome the 200-meter depth, the fighters crossed the ice-bound river Maana and began to climb the sheer cliff on the opposite side. After 2 hours of superhuman effort, the group reached the railway embankment leading directly to the plant gates, completely undetected. Joachim Runeberg distributed the tasks. Knut Haukelid and 3 other fighters remained outside to cover the retreat and block possible routes for the German guard to deploy. Runeberg himself and 3 saboteurs went to assault the main building. Using heavy bolt cutters, they cut the chain on the iron gates and penetrated the plant grounds. However, the entrance doors to the high-concentration plant were locked tight. Runeberg did not waste time trying to break them open, as that could have caused noise. Thanks to Tronstad's blueprints, he knew about the existence of a narrow cable tunnel through which electrical wires ran into the plant. Runeberg and Frederick Kaiser squeezed into the tight concrete duct and literally crawled on all 4s into the room, emerging right into the holy of holies of the German nuclear program, the hall with the electrolysis containers. Inside the hall was only one person, a Norwegian night worker, a lab assistant named Johansen. Upon seeing the armed men in British uniforms with submachine guns at the ready, he was struck dumb with terror. Runeberg ordered him to remain completely calm and silent, assuring him they had no intention of fighting Norwegians. At that moment, through a broken window, a 3rd saboteur, Birger Stromsheim, who had lost the group in the darkness outside, tumbled into the hall. The saboteurs operated with the precision of a well-honed automaton. they extracted pre-prepared shaped charges of Nobel 808 plastic explosive from their backpacks and attached them directly to the walls of 18 high-concentration electrolysis apparatuses. These apparatuses contained the entire plant's supply of heavy water, along with the equipment for its production. To guarantee complete destruction, Ronneberg decided to duplicate the detonation cords. An episode on the eve of the explosion truly reflected the character of the Norwegian commandos. A worker named Johansen suddenly complained that he had lost his glasses, which were impossible to replace under wartime shortages. Ronneberg halted the mining operation, searched the table with his men, and found the lab assistant's glasses. After this, Ronneberg lit the 30-second fuses, ordered the worker to run for cover, and left the plant with his group through a cable duct. The explosion, which thundered at 1:15 a.m., was not nearly as deafening as the saboteurs had expected. Due to the thick concrete walls of the basement and the massive equipment, only a muffled, dull thud was heard from the outside, resembling the pop of a blown electrical fuse or an exploding, faulty light bulb. The German sentry on duty at the main gate heard the sound, approached the plant door, jiggled the handle, shone his flashlight, and, seeing nothing suspicious, returned to his post without even raising the alarm. Meanwhile, a catastrophe for German science was unfolding inside the plant. The explosive charges tore open the casings of all 18 electrolysis units. More than half a ton of highly concentrated heavy water, the result of almost a year of the plant's uninterrupted work, gushed onto the concrete floor and flowed through drainage ditches straight into the sewer. The installation was completely disabled. While the German command was comprehending the scale of what had happened, the 9 Norwegians were already descending back into the gorge. After climbing the opposite side, they vanished into a snowstorm on the Hardangervidda plateau. Not a single saboteur was killed, wounded, or fired a single shot. The next morning, General von Falkenhorst, the commander of the Wehrmacht in Norway, arrived at the plant. After inspecting the explosion site, studying the traces left by the saboteurs, and examining the abandoned British submachine gun, the general, contrary to his subordinates' expectations, expressed professional admiration. In the presence of the plant's Norwegian administration, he uttered a phrase that became historic. "This is the best sabotage operation I have ever seen in my life." However, admiration was followed by a brutal manhunt. More than 3,000 Wehrmacht soldiers, SS units, Gestapo, and mountain troops were thrown into combing the Hardangervidda plateau and surrounding areas. German aircraft scoured every square meter of the snow-covered tundra. But the Norwegians displayed incredible coolness. The group split up. Joachim Ronneberg and 4 of his men made an unprecedented 400-kilometer ski trek across occupied Norway to neutral Sweden. They marched for 2 weeks in full battle gear and British military uniforms. The use of British uniforms was a deeply considered strategic move. If caught, they would demand prisoner of war status, and, most importantly, the German command could not apply mass reprisals and executions against the peaceful Norwegian population for harboring a local sabotage group. All 5 successfully crossed the Swedish border. Knut Haukelid and the remaining fighters stayed in Norway to rebuild the underground resistance network. The explosion at Vemork dealt a severe blow to the Nazi uranium club, but the Germans were not about to give up. The Third Reich's best engineering personnel were thrown at the plant. New components were delivered from Germany, and by April 1943, the repairs were completed, with heavy water production resuming by summer with even greater intensity. When intelligence data about the resumption of production reached Washington and London, the American military leadership decided to intervene. General Leslie Groves, the head of the American Manhattan Project to create the atomic bomb, stated that pinpoint sabotage did not guarantee a definitive solution to the problem. He insisted on a carpet bombing of the facility. The Norwegian government in exile categorically protested against the bombing. Professor Tronstad warned that the thick, reinforced concrete floors of the plant would protect the basement electrolysis workshops, and a massive raid would only lead to the deaths of peaceful Norwegian workers and residents of the nearby town of Rjukan. But the Americans insisted on their plan. If we look at the reports from that side and the records of the U.S. Air Force, we see a tragic picture. On November 16, 1943, 161 heavy B-17 Flying Fortress bombers of the U.S. 8th Air Force carried out a daylight raid on Vemork. Over 700 aerial bombs, with a total weight of more than 400 tons, were dropped on the plant and the surrounding area. The results of the bombing confirmed the Norwegians' worst fears. Due to the extremely complex terrain and high cloud cover, most of the bombs missed the target, destroying residential houses and auxiliary buildings. 22 Norwegian civilians were killed, including women and children. The electrolysis workshop itself, hidden in a deep basement under several layers of concrete, was practically undamaged. Heavy water production was halted only due to damage to the power grids and water pipes. Nevertheless, the American raid frightened the Wehrmacht High Command and the leadership of Albert Speer's Ministry of Armaments and War Production to death. The Germans realized that the Allies would not leave Vemork alone, and the next bombing could destroy the reservoir dam. In early 1944, Berlin made a decision to completely dismantle the heavy water production plant and urgently evacuate the entire accumulated stock of deuterium oxide, along with the special equipment, deep into the rear to German territory. Learning of the planned evacuation, London gave Knut Hauklid, who remained in the Norwegian underground, a categorical order. The train with heavy water must not reach Germany under any circumstances. Hauklid identified the weak points in the transportation route. The only way to remove the cargo from the plant was to load the tanks onto railway platforms, take them to Lake Tinsjø, ferry them to the opposite shore on the railway ferry Hydro, and then continue the journey by rail to the port. The ferry Hydro was the most vulnerable link in the entire logistics chain. But here, Haukelid and his underground fighters faced a terrible moral dilemma. The ferry Hydro was an ordinary passenger and cargo vessel. Besides the tanks of heavy water and the German guards, ordinary Norwegian citizens made daily trips on it. Peasants, women, children, factory workers. To mine the ferry meant to consciously send their own countrymen to their deaths. Haukelid contacted London, tried to request alternative attack options, but the response from the headquarters of the Special Operations Executive was adamant. The cargo must be destroyed in the deepest water. Any casualties among the civilian population are justified by the supreme strategic necessity. On the night of February 20th, 1944, Knut Haukelid and two of his comrades, disguised as passengers, made their way aboard the ferry Hydro, which was moored at the Mek Pier. Descending into the hold in the bow of the ship, they set kilograms of plastic explosives with a timer made from ordinary alarm clocks. The explosion was timed for when the ferry would be in the middle of the lake, where the depth reaches 430 meters. In such a case, raising the tanks from the bottom would be technically impossible. Of course. Here is the translation. At 10:45 a.m. on February 20th, 1944, when the ferry Hydro reached the middle of Lake Tinja, an explosion thundered. The bow of the ship instantly went underwater, and within 40 minutes the ferry sank. Along with it, the entire evacuated supply of the Third Reich's heavy water went to the bottom. 18 people perished in this disaster, 14 Norwegian civilian passengers and 4 German soldiers. 19 people were rescued. The story of the sabotage at Vemork and the sinking of the ferry Hydro entered the annals of world military history as a grand triumph of the secret services and an example of the selfless courage of Norwegian patriots. But now, decades later, when the archival documents of the Third Reich, the minutes of the Uranium Club meetings, and the records of the secret negotiations of German physicists have been declassified, we must ask the main historical and analytical question. How close was Nazi Germany in reality to creating nuclear weapons? Did 9 Norwegian commandos on skis truly save the world from Hitler's atomic hammer? To answer this question objectively, we must look into the Allied documents and the interrogations of German scientists. In the summer of 1945, as part of the American Special Intelligence Mission ALSOS, all the leading physicists of the German nuclear project, including Werner Heisenberg, Otto Hahn, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, and Kurt Diebner, were interned at the English estate Farm Hall. The premises were bugged with hidden microphones. British intelligence recorded every word uttered by the scientists in unofficial, private conversations when they did not know they were being eavesdropped on. And here a question arises that was long hushed up in official historiography. When, on August 6, 1945, the German physicists at Farm Hall heard the news on the radio about the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, Heisenberg and his colleagues at first simply refused to believe it. They were utterly convinced that if Germany, with its mighty chemical and physical schools, could not create an atomic bomb during the war years, then the United States was even less capable of it. Heisenberg spent several hours with a pencil and paper trying to calculate what critical mass of uranium the Americans had used, and his initial calculations were erroneous by several orders of magnitude. A deep analysis of the real state of the German nuclear project shows that by 1945, the Third Reich was at an infantile stage of creating atomic weapons, and the reason for this was not solely the shortage of heavy water from Vemork. Firstly, the Nazi nuclear program was catastrophically fractured and bureaucratically chaotic. Whereas in the USA, under the Manhattan Project, all scientific, production, and financial resources were united under the sole, rigid command of General Leslie Groves and Robert Oppenheimer. In Germany, there were at least 3 competing groups researching the atomic topic. The first, Heisenberg's group, under the auspices of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physics. The second, Kurt Diebner's group, under the control of the Army Weapons Office of the Wehrmacht. The third, an even more anecdotal one from a structural point of view, was the group of Manfred von Ardenne, funded by the Third Reich's Postal Ministry under the leadership of Reichsminister Wilhelm Ohnesorg. These groups competed for raw materials, uranium, and funding, hid research results from each other, and intrigued in the highest echelons of power. Secondly, the Nazi totalitarian ideology committed an act of scientific suicide. In the 1930s, so-called Aryan physics, Deutsche Physik, led by Nobel laureates Philipp Lenard and Johannes Stark, gained strength in Germany. They declared Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, quantum mechanics, and theoretical physics to be Jewish pseudoscience. As a result of mass purges, racial laws, and political pressure, German science lost the cream of world physics. Einstein, Niels Bohr, Enrico Fermi, Leo Szilard, Edward Teller, Eugene Wigner, and dozens of other outstanding minds fled the country. It was these scientists who emigrated to the United States and created the American atomic bomb. Hitler, with his own hands, expelled the people who could have given him a new weapon. Thirdly, there is the colossal gap in the scale of industrial funding. Let's ponder these figures, for in history, numbers always speak louder than any slogans. The American Manhattan Project involved over 130,000 people, with entire secret cities built: Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, Hanford. The project's funding exceeded $2 billion of that time, which in modern equivalent amounts to over $30 billion. And how much did the Nazi German government allocate for the entire uranium club? Over all the years of the war, the Reich's total expenditure on nuclear research, by various estimates, amounted to just a few million, to a couple of tens of millions of Reichsmarks. These were pennies, comparable to the cost of producing a couple of dozen heavy tanks. In June 1942, Minister of Armaments Albert Speer summoned Heisenberg to a meeting and directly asked, "How much money and resources do the physicists need to create a bomb capable of deciding the outcome of the war, and how much time would it take?" Heisenberg answered that creating the bomb would require years and hundreds of millions of marks, and he could not guarantee the result. In the end, Speer and Hitler bet on what seemed to them more realistic and quickly realizable projects of vengeance weapons: Wernher von Braun's V-2 ballistic missiles and V-1 cruise missiles. All major production capacities, skilled workers, and scarce materials were given to the rocket builders, not the physicists. But what about the physics itself? If we look at the state of the German experimental reactor B-8, which Heisenberg and his team tried to start in the spring of 1945, in a cave under the town of Haigerloch, we see an astonishing thing. Until the very end of the war, German physicists were unable to achieve a critical state in the reactor. They did not have a self-sustaining chain reaction. Even if they had tons of heavy water from Vemork, the design of the German reactor, with uranium cubes suspended on wires, was deeply flawed. Moreover, the Germans never approached solving the problem of extracting plutonium-239 from irradiated uranium, and did not create industrial plants for uranium isotope separation. From this arises the inevitable sweeping conclusion of most modern independent historians of science. By 1943 to 1944, Nazi Germany was at least 5 to 7 years of intense work and gigantic industrial efforts away from actually creating an atomic bomb, efforts for which the Reich, dying under the blows of the Red Army and the Allies, had neither the time, nor the resources, nor the economic base. And here, before us, the main historical paradox of the heavy water operation is fully revealed. On one hand, we are presented with the impeccable, legendary feat of 9 Norwegian partisans. 9 young men accomplished what seemed impossible. Under the brutal conditions of the Arctic winter, demonstrating incredible courage, composure, and tactical genius, they infiltrated the Wehrmacht's most heavily guarded facility without firing a single shot and destroyed it. Their Operation Gunnerside is rightly taught in all military academies around the world as the gold standard for small-scale sabotage operations. But the price of this feat proved tragically high. The deaths of 34 British sappers from Operation Freshman, destroyed homes, and the deaths of 22 civilians in Ryukyu during an American bombing raid, and 14 Norwegians killed on the sunken ferry Hydro. On the other hand, if we look at the situation from the perspective of dry historical analysis and documents, we see that Allied intelligence became a victim of its own massive paranoia. Fearing the authority of the German physics school and the persona of Heisenberg, the British and Americans sincerely believed that Hitler was on the verge of obtaining nuclear weapons. The operation at Vemork was carried out to eliminate a threat that, in reality, was a scientific and industrial myth. The Germans would not have been able to create an atomic bomb by the end of the war, even if the plant at Vemork had been operating at full capacity 24 hours a day and had flooded Berlin with heavy water. Let's summarize this incredible historical detective story. So who were these 9 Norwegians on skis? Great saviors of humanity who made a decisive turn in World War II and prevented Hitler's nuclear triumph? Or uncompromising heroes who were simultaneously victims of a grand strategic error by Allied intelligence, which forced people to risk their lives and lead to the death of their fellow citizens to destroy a phantom menace? I have presented you with the dry facts, figures, physical calculations, and declassified archival documents from both sides of this conflict. Weigh all the arguments presented and answer, which version of events seems most convincing and historically just to you personally? Write your opinion in the comments. Let's reason about it together.